I did not get a chance really to write much about my own life in the first book. This was a way for me to kind of flesh out the record and figure a few things out if possible along the way.
Hello, and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. The club would like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting today's Good Lit program. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Mary Trump. Mary is a psychologist who has taught graduate courses in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology. Her uncle, a real estate scion, reality show celebrity, and 45th President of the United States, is a person she has written about in Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, which describes pathological family dynamics which she says drove her uncle to be a serial fraud. In her next book, The Reckoning, she wrote about America as a traumatized collective, reduced to anger and fear by a series of traumas, not only from the Trump presidency, but from the behaviors that enabled Trump to capture the hearts and minds of so many Americans. She is joining us today to talk about her latest book, Who Could Ever Love You? A Family Memoir, a rather different and more personal work that we will get into in just a moment. Mary, welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back. It's great to meet you. I've been looking forward to this for a while now. This is actually my first book that was written way ahead of pub date, so we got to plan events,
Right.
which is exciting. And this is the first one.
Yes, and for our viewers, this is your very first time talking about the book to the general public. So I'm
right.
honored and just a little bit daunted because we're going to cover a lot of sensitive material here. I guess I better start off by asking you to describe the book, which deals with the Trump family, but it's very much a personal story. Talk about that a bit, and also talk about what motivated you to write it.
Starting with the second question first, I think a sort of standard response is that I owed my publisher a book, right? But I could have
Not
written
this
that.
book.
No, not this book. And it took a bit of time to get here, actually, because it was not an easy book to write. It wasn't easy material to revisit. I mean, not that I'd forgotten any of it, of course, but it had been a very long time since I dwelled in it to the extent I had to in order to write the memoir.
Yes, remembering a wounded childhood and saying it out loud and then to the world, those are two different things.
Yeah, and I think I came to realize over the last few years, which have not gone to plan, that there were reasons staring me right in the face why I was struggling so much. Obviously my first book came out at the height of COVID in July 2020, and that kind of set the course for the next couple of years. But, as other people were getting back out into the world, I wasn't. And I needed to figure out why, because I was having a very hard time making the connections with all of the amazing people I'd been able to meet since my first book came out. And I've had the privilege of sort of pivoting to become somebody who's commenting on the current state of American politics. And it was all happening still from my living room. And I just wasn't getting out in the world. And I realized that it was because of these much older, deeper traumas. It wasn't just because I'd been in lockdown essentially since 2016, November of 2016. It was because of all of these things that had happened when I was a kid. I did not get a chance really to write much about my own life in the first book, which I consider a psychological history of a family. I don't really consider it a memoir, and it served a purpose. It was a very important book for me to write at that time. But, a lot of the stories I wanted to tell about my dad weren't in there, and or my relationship with him. So this was a way for me to kind of flesh out the record and figure a few things out, if possible, along the way.
Yeah, and I think part of what you're saying, and part of what I drew from it was, even with all the therapeutic recognition, even with all of the healing, if you've been, not to spoiler alert, if you've been raised in a lack of love, if you are raised to believe you are not worthy of love, you can come on the other side of that and you can accommodate it, but it's still hard to act that way. And so in that sense, the book is a service to other people who are in that condition.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think this did start with the first book talking about trauma and how we're all traumatized by the last, well, some of us are traumatized by the last 8 years, but all of us are traumatized by the last 4. I mean, COVID left nobody unscathed. And when you've already been traumatized, it makes future traumas harder to deal with. You can't heal from trauma while you're in the process of being actively traumatized. And that's something I've come to recognize. I mean, I knew that, of course, as a psychologist, but I never really dealt with that personally. And, if my telling my story of trauma and of post-traumatic stress disorder can help anybody kind of get a handle on what they're experiencing, then I'll consider that a success. That's very important to me.
Well, it's a service. I mean, it's an immensely personal story, and as such, brave and commendable. And telling people this isn't weird is a really big service. This is accept this happens. You read at the beginning, for the better part of my life, I have been subsisting as opposed to living. And I started writing this book because I realized I was killing myself with stress, with self-loathing, but above all, with isolation. So, well, first off, I want to ask, how you doing?
That's fascinating. That's hard to hear. I've never heard those words out loud. Well, I guess I did when I was recording the audiobook, but it's a different experience to hear somebody else.
Another voice, yeah.
Yeah. So how am I doing? Well, other than getting over COVID, which is a trick and a half. I've never had COVID before. Wow. It's awful. So, I'm making strides, but other than that, I honestly, having this being able to look forward to this book coming out has actually been really helpful. Because again, I did have a few months to prepare myself, unlike the first book, which was published like 2 minutes after I finished writing it. So I think knowing that there were going to be public events, knowing that I might actually be going into studios, which I'd never done before because of COVID, it kind of motivated me in a way, because I've been hiding, and it's unhealthy, and it doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, I understand it, but it doesn't make sense for what I want to accomplish and the kind of life I want to live. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm totally fine, because that will take a lot more work, certainly. But having these moments to look forward to and work towards actually have made a difference.
Well, and I hope talking about it, I mean, it was weird hearing it from me just now, but that's also the process of normalizing it. And I hope going out and talking about it and sharing this book with people does normalize it. I must say, I mean, my experience doesn't have a patch on yours, which is world class, but nonetheless, there are parts of my own experience I recognized here, and you have to work on these things and kind of find out it's not weird. It's not a source of shame to feel this way, and that's useful. So let's get into the specifics. A little bit of history for people who don't know. So there's some context for your story. Talk about Fred Trump Sr., your grandfather. He's kind of the original sin here, as it were. Who was he and what was he like?
I think the most basic thing to know about my grandfather, Donald's father, is that he was a straight up sociopath. And I mean that diagnostically, not colloquially. He was somebody devoid of human feeling. He had very tight control over his world, which consisted of his business and his home, which, by the way, we called the house.
Right.
I still find that fascinating. And it was always capital H, house. We're going to the house. He was very much in the mold of a man who grew up in the, when was he born? He was born in, I think, 1905. Very much a man of his time. He had very little use for women and believed that your oldest son would be your namesake and would be the inheritor of your business. And in my grandfather's case, that business was an empire. So my dad had the great misfortune of being the oldest son and namesake. And when my grandfather found that he did not measure up, and this happened, by the way, fairly early on, it's not as if my father tried and failed. My grandfather judged him harshly from the beginning and treated him very differently, not as you would expect. Like, he wasn't spoiled, he wasn't given preferential treatment because he was Fred Trump Jr. successor. He was treated worse. He was deprived in a way the other children were not. So he got a lot of attention, but it was all negative attention meant to toughen him up. Sadly, my father was not a tough person. He was actually a very sweet, kind, generous, very funny, very talented person, who may have done well in the family business. He just wasn't given a chance because, according to my grandfather's standards, which, by the way, we never knew what they were, my dad just didn't measure up. So, you know, it was doomed from the start. He was doomed from the start. And the rest of us mattered not at all. The only other person who mattered to my grandfather was Donald, because he needed somebody. So for various reasons, Donald became the person who was going to be elevated to be the successor, to be the inheritor of the empire. So the rest of us
Jump in
struggled.
here. When you
Of
say
course.
he didn't measure up, in what way did he not measure up? He wasn't Fred Trump, or?
Well, I think my grandfather wanted a killer. That was his term. He wanted a killer. I don't know why one needed to be a killer to collect rent in Queens and Brooklyn, or to build buildings in Queens and Brooklyn, but that's what was required. And again, it didn't make sense, but whatever it meant, my father couldn't do it. And he needed somebody. Well, I don't necessarily know that my grandfather knew at the time, but then Donald came along, who was this very self-promoting. My dad called Donald the great I am. He was a narcissist from the very beginning. He was a bully. And my grandfather liked what he saw and, you know, wanted somebody who could do that for the business and who could move into Manhattan in a way my grandfather never could, because my grandfather just wasn't good at that kind of promotion. So my dad quickly was pushed aside. And, you know, after he left the company to become an airline pilot for TWA in 1964 and then came back again, there was literally no place for him in the business anymore.
Yeah. And we'll get back to that dynamic because that's quite interesting in the story. But now let's turn that to your mother. Who was your mother? Linda Clapp is your mother.
My mom grew up in a working class family. She grew up for the most part in Michigan, and my grandfather, her dad, whom people called Mike, was he owned a feed company, and then he was a long haul trucker. But then my grandmother had terrible rheumatoid arthritis, so they had to move to Florida when my mom, I think, was 13, and my grandfather bought a clam shack on the beach. So after a fairly idyllic childhood in Michigan, my mom was displaced at a terrible time to move. 13 is not a good age to uproot everything. And she struggled until she became a member of the synchronized swimming team at her high school. She had no intention of going to college, so she worked a few jobs and was on vacation in the Bahamas with a friend of hers, which is where she and my dad met. My dad was a sophomore, I believe, at Lehigh. He was already flying. He got his private and commercial pilot's licenses while he was still in college. And they agreed to meet in Manhattan, and they hit it off, but then nothing happened for a couple of years. And in the interim, she became what they called at the time, a stewardess for National Airlines, relocated to New York. And then that's when she and my dad met up again and eventually got engaged and married.
It's interesting, at that time in particular, flying and air travel were so associated with glamour and freedom. And for various reasons, they both walked away from that life of glamour and freedom. They couldn't see themselves or compel themselves to get there. What do you think they saw in each other? It's difficult to explain our parents, maybe, but
yeah.
What do you think your father saw in your mother? Because she is a problematic character in this book.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that my mom loved being a stewardess and would have continued, but at that time, you could not be married and be a stewardess. Okay. So her very last flight, I think, was the day before the wedding, and then she became a receptionist because she did want to work. I mean, credit where credit is due. And then she had to quit that job because she got pregnant and women weren't allowed to work while they were pregnant. So she got completely trapped by those
completely
circumstances.
Disappointing. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder how things might have been different if she could have continued to fly or work in any capacity. I think my dad, first of all, they were extraordinarily young. I think she was 19 and he was 20 when they first met. And she was 22 and he was 23 when they married, which is, it's insane. I know that was quite common back then, but that just seems completely crazy to me. So part of it was that it was time, right? And she was extremely attractive and very, she admired him greatly and found him funny, which he was. And I think at the time that might have been enough for him. Mm-hmm. Plus they had the flying in common and they enjoyed the same kinds of things. They loved going out to clubs in the city. And my dad had a plane and he would fly her and friends out to Bimini for the weekend or out to Montauk to go deep sea fishing.
Right.
And she could keep up with him. And I think he also liked that.
But let's get to the big part of the book, which is your own story inside this world. By the time you show up, that's already changing rather radically. And it's fair to say that your experience, broadly, is kind of a continuous and often casual failure to see or acknowledge you.
Yeah, I think, one of the hardest things about my childhood, in retrospect, because I'm sure I didn't recognize this at the time, is that my dad, who was, if you ask anybody who knew him at the time, was the best guy. Like, people to this day say that they had the best experiences with him. He was the kindest, the funniest, the most generous, etc. He was an extraordinarily talented pilot. By the time I was born, that person no longer existed. So I was sort of deprived of the opportunity of knowing him. And my parents were trapped in this not particularly nice apartment in a building my grandfather owned in Jamaica, Queens. My mother struggled with depression. My dad, especially after he quit flying for TWA, which again was the second biggest airline on the planet. And he had this amazing job. But he quit because he was drinking too much. So his drinking was out of control and they never recovered. So that was sort of the context in which I was born.
Well, he was also being shamed by his grandfather, you say. He drank because he had shame about giving up his dream, and he drank because he had shame about his father's expectations, which were never met. Your father called him a glorified bus driver.
Yeah.
Or your grandfather,
Yes.
rather. Fred called your father
Yeah.
a glorified bus driver. So
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to know if it was the drinking that made him quit or the shame that caused him to drink, at least in reading the book.
It was the shame that caused him to drink, that caused him to have to quit.
Right.
And I think he was asked to resign because if he had been fired, his license probably would have been taken away. But he retained his license. But yes, my grandfather, I think, was the only person on the planet who didn't appreciate how ridiculously cool and amazing it was to be a pilot of jets in 1964.
We'll get into that in a sec. There is a kind of sometimes almost willful cruelty in your own experience, though. Like your mother ignores these life-threatening asthma attacks you have, or this absolutely ludicrous letter shows up from some anonymous person to her, and she shows it to you to create a kind of sense of shame in you, I guess. I don't know. But what's compelling that, you think? Is there just a massive self-involvement? What made that happen?
Yeah, I think part of it was a need for attention. It's kind of complicated and interestingly, I haven't thought it through entirely because I don't really know. I can only speculate. But some of it was, just to back up and give a little bit of background, I started having very bad asthma attacks when I was about 5. I'd had a serious case of croup before, and very often, if you have croup, you will develop asthma. And they were really bad attacks. And this was after my parents had already split up. So she's a single mother of 2 very small children. She's depressed and has no resources. She did not do well in the divorce. We had an apartment that was in my grandfather's building, but, it wasn't particularly well maintained. She didn't have money. So she was trapped. She was effectively trapped and had all of the responsibility for 2 kids, and an ex-husband whose family utterly disdained her, and who had written off my dad. So she had none of the benefits of being in this extraordinarily wealthy, powerful family at all. So perhaps it was her way of controlling a situation. Perhaps it was her way of refusing to cede control or refusing to be the only person who had to take responsibility. Why isn't anybody else here at 2 a.m. to take her to the hospital? Why do I have to do it? And I think over time, it became clear to me that the worse my attacks got, the more I ended up spending days at a time in the hospital, the more attention she got. If I had just had an asthma attack and got it taken care of right away, nobody would know. But if I'm in the hospital for 4 or 5 days, people knew. And she got a lot of sympathy and attention because she was my mom. And
This is bordering on Munchausen syndrome,
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities there. Yeah.
So you're living in this apartment building that belongs to Fred Trump. And as I read it, just as an aside in the book, you later find out your own trust fund is paying the rent. And you didn't know that. So your mother's in between. And then you're going to this place, the house, where there's all this wealth, all this abundance. And your you're given a private school, but made to understand this is really under Fred's sufferance. This is Fred's world. What was it like kind of continuously living in these two worlds and crossing that absence of wealth gap?
It was normal.
When you're a kid, everything's normal. You have no comparison.
Yeah, I was aware. I was definitely aware. I grew up in Jamaica. My grandparents' house was in Jamaica Estates, which is where my dad and his siblings grew up. They're completely different worlds. Jamaica Estates is this very upper middle class, at the time, 100% white neighborhood. And Jamaica was working class, lower middle class, predominantly Black when I was growing up. Obviously, it was segregated by Highland Avenue, but still a predominantly Black neighborhood. So, I understood the difference. I took the subway to my private school and understood that, other kids didn't do that.
Which one were you a part of?
Jamaica. I felt completely grounded there. I didn't feel at home in my home, but I felt at home in Jamaica. Even though I recognized that I kind of stood out, I would come home from school on the subway wearing my private school uniform, so I wasn't exactly your typical Jamaica kid, but that's probably one of the best things that ever happened to me was growing up in Jamaica.
Yeah, there's some level of acceptance there. And that gets to what comes through. And we were discussing this a little bit before we went on the air. The chief dynamic that comes through in this family, which extends to your mother's relationship with you, is a kind of system of withholding, that attention is withheld, money is withheld, friendship is withheld, love is withheld, as a means to control people, so that people are seeking, they have to ask for things that should just be given freely, like love or like attention. They have to ask for it, scheme for it, figure out, how am I going to get it this time? And Fred's at the top of that, right? Fred Sr. is at the top of that, and there's no saying what's going to work. As you said, your father couldn't measure up, but he also couldn't figure out what measuring up means.
Yeah, that is a really good way of putting it. And what I think one of the central tragedies of certainly my dad's generation, and also to an extent mine, is that we actually thought there was something we could do.
Right.
To get our grandfather to care about us. Like, he was the most important person for everybody, even though the guy barely acknowledged my existence, but still, we all strived desperately to figure out, okay, what is it I need to do to get Grandpa to think I'm worth something?
Right.
And none of us ever realized that it was an impossible task, because he literally didn't care about anybody but Donald.
And what's strange to an independent reader is how very powerful and effective and addictive that is. Why can't anybody just say, you're crazy, I'm out of here? But you can't. People are addicted to seeking this approval, and the signal is irregular, so you never figure out how to get it. And your father breaks down and keeps coming back. He tries to move it into the house, even though that's the place where it all began.
Yeah, it's a terrible cycle of dependence and control. And, again, we all participated in it to varying degrees. My mother kept going back to the house for holidays years after my parents were divorced. Like very often, she would be there for Thanksgiving and Christmas, even if my dad wasn't. She kept going even after my dad died. And it's very difficult to, I think the idea of having it, of describing it as addictive behavior is very interesting because there's really no rational explanation.
No, it wasn't like she was going there and having a good time.
No, they hated her. They
Right.
treated her with utter contempt. And generally speaking, they ignored her,
Right.
just leaving me to kind of keep her company and take care of her, which would have been easier if we hadn't been there, And even my Aunt Marianne, who was also part of the same behaviors my dad engaged in for a long time. They were the two oldest children. They felt like they could never ask for anything. And she was in an abusive marriage, had very serious financial problems, couldn't ask. My grandparents knew that she was in an abusive relationship and they did nothing to help her. And she probably had a trust fund. I mean, these were very wealthy people, but just suffered until he just took off one day. And then in her own way, though, she kept trying to be accepted, even though she became a federal judge. And the only thing my grandfather had to say about it at her swearing in was, well, at least you have a good pension now. He didn't care. He did not care about anybody's accomplishments, except Donald's big ones.
I mean, this is kind of the great paradox. He is the great withholder. He is the great diminisher. He is addictive. I got to say, reading this book, he's also fundamentally boring. He really isn't a very interesting person. So how does he keep this hold on everybody?
Well, abuse is a very powerful tool. If you're the wielder of it and the people against whom you're wielding it are all dependent on you to one degree or another. And all of his children always were, because he had the money and money stood in for everything. It was literally the only currency in the family. And, what happens to somebody who is not valued in any way? They get disinherited. What happens to siblings whose brother died at the age of 42? Well, they keep it all for themselves because that means they're worth something. It was the only measurement that made sense. And yeah, he was a deeply boring, I mean, as you can perhaps imagine, it was very difficult for me to have conversations with these people because they didn't read, they had no interest that aligned with mine. They only talked about sort of New York politics and real estate and women they thought were ugly and men they thought were losers. Like that was the dinner table conversation. Hey. I was completely ill-equipped to engage, and not that anybody had any interest in anything I had to say anyway.
And yet their lives themselves are the stuff of great novels where an original wrong, a weird void, is echoing down through the generations. You say in the book, all relationships in my family are transactional. You also say, I like this, lawsuits my family's love language. A lack of trust, a sense of material gain as signifying something, a need to get back and to win approval or also have it over the other person. I'm not going to psychoanalyze this, but hey, I've got a psychologist right here. When you hear your uncle on the campaign trail using rhetoric like, wouldn't you like me to do this? Should I fire those people? Getting the crowd to kind of give him permission to do something bullying or transgressive. Do you have echoes of Jamaica Estates?
Yeah, Donald has an audience of one. Very much like my Aunt Marianne, he's still looking for his father's approval. And, because Donald knows on a deep level that he's nothing, that he is the loser that he's so terrified other people think he is. And that is something that was not allowed in my family. He knows what the fate was because he saw what happened to my dad. My dad was essentially killed off at the age of 42 because, again, he didn't measure up to these immeasurable standards. And Marianne lived to be, I think, 85. And, when she and I used to spend a fair amount of time together, even in her late 70s, early 80s, she was clearly trying to figure out how to get her dad's approval or, mystified why she didn't get it. And for both of these people, it spurred them, that void spurred them to do horrific things. And sadly, for all of us, Donald's still doing them.
And it speaks to something in their own childhoods because the point eventually of raising a child is to let them go. You don't want them always depending on you or always seeking your approval in a sense. They should become themselves. But there's something in Fred's background, or maybe he's just the bad seed, I don't know. But there's an interest in manipulating the children that's kind of broken.
Yeah, that is one of the fascinating things about my grandfather. As I've said, he had no interest in most of us, like at all. And yet he needed us around. You've said that it's maybe, if not surprising, still shocking that my dad stuck around.
Yeah.
He could have, if he could have figured out how, he probably had a lot of money that he could have gotten access to, and he could have gone off and he could have continued flying his planes and lived his life and been infinitely more happy.
I got to admit, I was yelling at your book. I was like, guy, just leave town.
Oh, right. And he couldn't, but what's even more shocking, because that actually does make sense when you see how abused he was, how beaten down. My grandfather dismantled this man, his son. So I don't believe towards the end my father had any free will. Plus, of course, he was very ill. He had open heart surgery when he was 39, and he was an alcoholic who smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. What's much more mystifying to me is why my grandfather wanted my dad around. He had nothing but contempt for him. And yet, I think part of it was to hide his failure from the world. Like, he didn't want people to see that his oldest son and namesake was such a loser. But I think it was also the ability to sort of wield the control of a serial killer. Like, I refer to my grandfather as a serial killer. As far as I know, he only actually killed my dad, but he had 5 destroyed human beings for children. And I just think on some level, he enjoyed seeing how much of an impact he had on the lives of those of us he still didn't even care about.
Okay, I'm going to go there. If Grandpa is a totalitarian and an authoritarian, when you see your uncle with a Vladimir Putin, a Kim Jong-il, a Viktor Orban, fill in the blank, what's going on there for you?
Yeah, it's awful, actually.
Well, is he seeking the approval of another dictator, or is he capable of standing up to a dictator? Also, what is this telling us about history? Are politicians driven by a lack and a need that we don't even understand?
Well, some are, for sure. I mean, Donald certainly is. He again, unconsciously knows that he's worthless. He's unlovable. He's unloved because he's been rendered unlovable by the very man who created him. So I think part of it is trying to fill that void. Like, if he can have the kind of power a Putin or a Kim Jong-un has, then maybe that will fill the void. Of course it won't. But he also has deluded himself into thinking he deserves that kind of power. He deserves to rule in perpetuity because he's just better than everybody. Like, that's the lie he's been telling himself forever. The weirdest experience I have in watching him with a Putin, for example, is his subservience. He was never subservient to my grandfather. So I'm not entirely sure where that shift happened. But that is still something I grapple with trying to understand, because Donald, when my grandfather was still a vital, strong man, Donald treated him like he was an equal, if not slightly beneath him. When my grandfather started getting Alzheimer's and losing his capacity to remember and to be in charge, Donald treated him with nothing but contempt. It was quite disgraceful.
Okay. You say he is unlovable or feels he is incapable of love, but I think it's safe to say that 30 or 40% of the country does love him. He's doing fine running for president a second time. What accounts for his popularity in your view? Does a significant part of the country want a bully? Does a significant part of a country have this kind of a lack and feel this power of withholding that they're also addicted to? Psychoanalyze America for a minute.
No problem.
Yeah.
We really need it. We need to be on a couch somewhere, being given lots of therapy.
Well,
I mean, first of all, they're being loved by total strangers is very different from being loved by the people closest to you.
True.
Nobody close to Donald loves him, and he doesn't love anybody. It's a tragedy because of how it affects all of us. That is not where you want to be in your life. So, if we want to feel sorry for Donald at all, and I'm sure most people do not, we can feel sorry for the child he was, who, again, was rendered unlovable by his father, because my grandfather needed Donald for to use towards his own ends, basically. So what is wrong with 40% of America? Well, any society has about, let's say, 25 to 28% who are just sort of, the worst of us, right? There are people who have authoritarian personalities. There are people who don't like change. They like being told what to do. They like strong men. And, we can safeguard. I think one of the main purposes of liberal democracy is sort of to keep those people from power. And then Donald gets into the White House, probably the greatest tragedy in modern American history. And that significant minority grows. And the disease of ignorance and intolerance and cruelty spreads. It metastasizes. And suddenly, next thing you know, it's not 25% anymore, it's 45%. And that's where we are now. The question for all of us is going to have to be, what do we do to reverse that trend? Obviously, if the worst thing happens and he gets back in, I don't believe we ever will. But let's be hopeful and let's say, okay, if he loses, is the fever going to break? What do we need to do to make sure, one, that this kind of thing never happens again, and two, we help people see that this is not the path we can be on, if we want to have the kind of society that is going to make all of us better people. I think in the sort of short version of why is that there are a lot of people in this country who like what Donald has to offer. They like his cruelty. They like the fact that he lies and gets away with it. They like the fact that he's a criminal who's never held to account. They like the fact that he's a loser and he fails up time and time again. We have to face that. We have to face that there are tens of millions of people in this country who actually like what he's done to us.
In times of confusion, authoritarianism seems like an answer. But at this point, he is an adjudicated rapist and a convicted felon. That doesn't seem to slow people down. So
No, and also I think it's worth remembering that he's often been the one sowing the confusion or worsening it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have questions from the audience, and they do care about you. Can you talk about how you became interested and began to study clinical psychology?
Yeah, for reasons that I don't completely understand. My mother was always a proponent of therapy. She and my dad had seen a marriage counselor, which, I mean, maybe it ended the way it should because they got divorced. And, I, as a kid, struggled, probably for obvious reasons, with depression sometimes. I had a very hard time after my dad died. And, I think that I was consistently in therapy from the time I was, say, 16 to the time I was in my mid-30s. Mm-hmm. Then I took a break, and I didn't go back into therapy again until I had to go away for trauma treatment in 2017. So it was through my experiences with therapy, but it's particularly my experience with group therapy that made me realize that psychology was something that I thought was worth studying. At that point, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I just didn't see a path forward for various reasons. And when I was at Columbia grad school for English Lit, I'd also taken a course in psychoanalytic theory, which also really resonated with me in a way that deconstruction did not. So I think it was both that experience and being in group therapy and seeing what a powerful tool it was in the right hands that led me to shift gears and take some courses. And then finally, I applied to doctoral programs.
It is notable that you were set back and sent back into therapy after the election of your uncle. Do you see those two as being related?
Oh, totally. And again, it's not because Donald was a big part of my life. He wasn't. No. We'd been estranged, I don't know, since 2000.
Decades.
And 2000, I guess, okay. 1999. But, suddenly, I didn't care that he had a reality TV show. I didn't care about any of that. And I'd basically done my best to kind of move on from having anything to do with my family. But then suddenly he's running and he's everywhere in a way that I can't ignore. I can ignore The Apprentice. I can't ignore a presidential campaign. And I certainly couldn't ignore his behavior. And it just suddenly felt like I had no control. And it was incredibly debilitating. Plus, he was divisive in a way no politician had ever been. I lived in a very Republican town. Excuse me. It had never mattered. It started to matter. And that also took a toll.
I'll take another question from the audience. This one's very to the point. How do you find emotional space for yourself when you are treating clients? I think that could be asked of any psychologist.
Yeah, well, luckily I don't practice anymore, so I don't have to grapple with that. But I do know from former colleagues that especially after the election and even more so during COVID, It was extraordinarily difficult to do that.
Another question. What is the best way to break the cycle of trauma in a family?
I think it depends on who's the source of it. And, sometimes you need to make a clean break, but more than anything, you need to get help. Dealing with trauma is not really something you could do alone, especially long-term trauma that becomes complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what I have. It's when trauma is repeated over time. It's incredibly debilitating. And, again, we all got traumatized, whether in the election or during COVID. And if you've already suffered from trauma, you got re-traumatized. And I think it's also very important to recognize that trauma, you can't cure it. You can only manage it, mitigate the effects of it.
Accommodate.
And I was sort of hoping that COVID would be a wake-up call for this country and we would start paying more attention to the mental health crisis from which we're suffering. And that didn't happen. So anybody listening, just realize that, getting help is crucially important, because untreated psychiatric disorders don't get better on their own. I think, Quentin, you said this at the beginning, it takes work, and it doesn't seem fair. We don't traumatize ourselves. But it's true. So I guess one way to look at it is we have the power to do something about it.
Right.
And that can be very helpful, because trauma can also make us feel like we have no control over anything.
I don't think fairness is really the issue here. Nothing is fair in this. What are you going to do about it, and how are you going to heal is more the issue. Another audience question. Now that your book will be published, or is published, is there an additional story you wish you had added or included?
Oh, that is a really good question. Probably. I made a very specific decision to make the first 3 parts only the first 17 years of my life, and then skip over a bunch of stuff to get to present day issues, because I thought that, those formative years were most relevant to the experiences I've been having in the last, say, 8 years. Undoubtedly, it's quite tricky figuring out, what aspects of your life to share because let's face it, that, one is sharing the information to make oneself understood. It was very important to me that I be understood. But at the same time, you need to be making creative decisions so that the narrative arc is compelling and makes sense and fits. So I can't think of anything specifically right now, but I want to think about it and figure that out, because I'm sure there are many things that got left on the cutting room floor simply because they didn't move the narrative in a way I wanted the narrative to move.
Well, I assure you are a writer, because your answer touches on various emotional dimensions, but you're also paying attention to structure. And structurally, you have to leave things out.
Yeah.
Too much is not information. Yeah. I did want to ask you this, too. You, by your own description, you are an intensely private person initially, and then even more so in the wake of COVID, something of a shut-in. But you've also put yourself in a position of being a hero to some part of the country and a villain to other parts of the country. People who don't have a chance of meeting you have opinions about you of all sorts. the positive and the negative ones based on about the same level of information. You have a YouTube show called The Mary Trump Show. Are you kind of occupying two worlds here again?
Yeah, well, I think part of that was just born of necessity. In 2017, I started working with investigative reporters at the New York Times on that groundbreaking, vast story they published in 2018 about my family's financial history. And that was completely private and nobody knew I existed. And that was great with me. And it probably would have been very bad if anybody knew, but it didn't move the needle enough. And I felt like I had to do more. That's when my first book came in. And then it was the same thing. It's like, if I have an opportunity to create a platform to discuss what I believe needed to be discussed in the lead up to the 2020 election, then I needed to do that. And that's what I've continued to do. It hasn't always been comfortable, but sadly, for many, many reasons, some simple and some complicated, Donald remains a force in American politics, and we are far too close for comfort in this election. It's devastating, but here we are, and it just didn't feel like it was the time for me to go back to being a private person. On the other hand, though, as a kid, I was extremely outgoing. I had enormous amounts of confidence, and maybe I guess it's time for me to try to tap into that. Not that it doesn't, it's funny because that's naturally who I was, but it doesn't feel natural anymore. But maybe I need to kind of channel that now. And maybe that's what I've been doing and just sort of reverting to type in a way, not finding it that comfortable. But, it's not like I'm pretending to be something. I was those things decades ago, but still, that's who I was for the first 16 years of my life.
Mm-hmm. I got to break the fourth wall here because I know you're dealing with day 12 of COVID, and I don't want to overtax you. I did not bring a watch. Do we have a time check? How much? Oh, okay. We have a little bit more time. Let's talk a little bit about your brother as well, because he has not come up, but he's mentioned in the book. He was older and not really on the scene. And of course, he has a book out right now as well. Have you read his book?
No, I haven't.
And you two are estranged. For things, do you feel that source of estrangement, which you discuss in the book, has to do with this dynamic and this sense of lack, or is something else going on?
I mean, I think in some ways, how do you grow up in this family and know how to do anything? I think that's part of it. And I cannot pretend to know what my brother's motives are, but it seems that he made a choice to try to remain part of the Trump family. And I made the opposite choice. It doesn't work for me. I personally don't see how I can maintain my sense of who I am and be part of that family.
Yeah.
They, not only on the personal side, they destroyed my father. They tried to destroy my mother. They treated us horribly and cruelly. But then there's also the politics of it all. Donald Trump is a fascist. And I do not in any way understand wanting to be aligned with somebody like that, no matter what your personal feelings are. And that's my position. It's not my place to judge, but that's how I feel.
This is a slightly awkward moment because you wrote in the book, but I must raise it. Your brother seems to have broken with you over your choice of partner superficially, but it really happens once you decide to have a child. He's not judgmental when you're in love with another woman. He's judgmental when you elect to have a child. And somehow I couldn't help but think this somehow speaks to the family romance to him. This somehow takes it into an area he can't accept. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's notable. It's not about being a lesbian. It's about being a lesbian with a child.
Yeah, and again, we never had a conversation, and we did try about 8 years after that to heal the rift a bit. Like we were back in contact for a while after that. That, of course, ended when I told him about my first book and the lawsuit I was bringing. But yes, it was very odd. And again, we never had a conversation about it. So I don't know how he felt about my being in a relationship with a woman, but it became how he felt about our having a child became abundantly clear when he stopped talking to me. And again, we never had a conversation about it. So I was left to speculate, and that played a pretty significant role in our inability to heal the rift successfully, because we never did.
That's another dimension of growing up in that world of lack and withholding. You can't ever explain why things happen. There's no room to discuss things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We didn't talk about anything, any of us, in any deep, real way. It was too scary. And I often feel like that's sort of where we are as a country. We're so afraid.
And none of this is weird. We elect to feel like it's weird.
Right.
You've been really calm while we discuss a number of sensitive things in your life. You have written about them. I commend you. But it's hard for many people to get there.
It really is. And I think that's a big part of why we're in the trouble we're in, because it's very isolating if you feel that you have to keep everything to yourself, whether because you're afraid you'll be judged or you're afraid that it will reveal something about you that you don't want to reveal. It cuts us off. And I think this has been a big part of the problem of the last 8 years. We've been subsisting on this very narrow band of the human emotional experience. It's all been fear and anger and rage. And I think one of the reasons Vice President Harris's campaign has started resonating with so many people, it's suddenly like we're feeling these other things that are deeply human, joy and happiness, and it's like okay again. And it's as if we've been in a dungeon and just finally somebody opened the door and we're feeling the sun on our faces for the first time in forever. So I think you're right. Whether it's cultural or historical or familial, so many of us are afraid to talk about our feelings because we're worried that it's going to be painful. And it might be, but it will get us through to something that we aren't experiencing because we're not willing to take that risk. And often it's something wonderful and worth sacrificing for.
If it starts in childhood, children tend to fetishize their shame and they think it'll destroy the world. And the fact is, it's just not that weird. It was a terrible thing you went through, but it's a human story. These things happen to people.
And that's sort of the story of trauma as well. In order to, if you've experienced a severely traumatic event, what happens is you cut it off from the feelings. Like I have absolutely no feelings about being in that bed suffocating to death next to my mother for hours on end. I have no feelings about it. That means that I haven't done the work. I haven't done enough work. I have to feel those feelings. But the thought of that is absolutely mind-numbingly terrifying because those feelings are going to kill me, right? I don't want to feel them, but we all need to, in order to get to the other side of it. And I think if we trust that, then things can change.
Change gears as we come to the final question. What do you think the last 2 months and the elevation of Kamala Harris to the presidency and her strategy of never taking the bait, of never reacting to the bully side, is doing to your uncle?
He's not having a good time. He is literally panicked and enraged and terrified, pretty much constantly at this point. And it's really gratifying to see Vice President Harris taking the tack she's taking. I advocated for that in 2020, but unfortunately, too many people still were acting as if it was politics as usual. And clearly it is not. So she definitely has his number. And I think the debate next Tuesday will be revelatory.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for her to press him. I'm looking for her to stop him in his tracks and to push back and not to let him get away with his egregious lying. And I'm looking for her to tell him what she thinks of him. Because he does not deserve to be protected by the respect of the office he once held, because nobody has done more to demean the office than Donald Trump has. So, he often gets treated with kid gloves simply because he was in the Oval Office. And I think that has to stop. And I think she is the person, not to coin a phrase, but to prosecute that case against him. And I'm pretty sure she's looking forward to it, which is a great thing.
Well, all this pain and the courage that went into it, you're on a mission to normalize America.
Well, let's get a little healthier. Let's get healthier and let's get kinder. That would be good.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've reached the point in our program where we got to close. I very much enjoyed this conversation. I commend you on your courage and your success in writing this book, and have a great tour. Our thanks to Mary Trump, author of Who Could Ever Love You, a family memoir. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Mary's new book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort in making virtual and in-person programming a success, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Quentin Hardy. Thank you and take care.